We talked about the demand side. So now let's turn to the supply side. Price elasticity of supply is a measure of how much the quantity supplied of a good responds to a change in the price of that good. So it's a reciprocal of demand. Price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of supply is the percentage change in quantity supplied resulting from a percentage change in price. So when you look at the formula, it is very similar to, it's almost the same as the price elasticity of demand. The only difference is instead of using the percentage change in quantity demanded, we now have percentage change in quantity supplied in the numerator. Okay? So percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. So let's get familiar with some terminology. So we're looking at a perfectly inelastic supply. This is when the price elasticity of supply is equal to 0. So obviously this is an extreme case, okay, but it's always easier to start illustrating the examples using the extreme case. Okay? So as you can see, regardless of the change in the price, the quantity supply stays the same. So that means sellers, they do not have a lot of flexibility. Well, actually, I should say they do not have any flexibility at all in changing the quantity demanded. So the price is fixed at 100 units regardless of the change in the price. So we have a vertical supply curve here. And then we have a normal looking upward sloping supply curve. And in this case, a 22% increase in price leads to a 10% increase in quantity supply. So by definition, it is an inelastic supply because the price elasticity of supply is less than 1. Okay? And then we have a flatter supply curve. Okay? So it is a unit elastic supply in this case because the price elasticity of supply is equal to 1. So 22% increase in price in this case leads to 22% increase in quantity supplied. Okay, so this is a unit elastic supply. And then we have an even flatter supply curve. Okay, so this is an elastic supply by definition. The price elasticity of supply is greater than 1. 22% increase in price leads to 67% increase in quantity supply. So we have an elastic supply. So another extreme case, a horizontal supply curve. So this represents a perfectly elastic supply. So this is when the price elasticity of supply is equal to infinity. So at any price above $4, quantity supply is infinite. At exactly $4, producers will supply any quantity, very flexible. At a price below $4, so even a teeny little bit, the quantity supply is 0. All the suppliers are gone. So they're very flexible. So it's a perfectly elastic supply. So once again, let's go over the relationship between the price elasticity of supply and the shape of the supply curve. So this is when the price elasticity of supply is equal to 0. And then greater than 0 but less than 1, and then equal to 1, and then greater than 1, and then infinity. So similar to the demand side, you can see that the more elastic the supply curve becomes, the more elastic the supply becomes, the flatter the supply curve. Okay. So we're not gonna, I'm not gonna go over the calculations of price elasticity of supply here because it's a very similar formula, similar calculation to what we learned in the price elasticity of demand. Okay. So let's touch on some of the determinants of the price elasticity of supply. So these are factors that can affect the size of the price elasticity of supply. So first, it has something to do with the nature of the product or the nature of the business. So in other words, it has to do with the ability of sellers to change the amount of the good they produce. So for example, beachfront land is inelastic. So as some of you may recall, in early 2000, we had a housing bubble. So we had a real estate boom. Okay, so in addition to the first home, a lot of people bought a second home for investment purpose, and for second home, a lot of people like to, go for beachfront properties. But as we observed, even when the price skyrocketed for this kind of property, the quantity supplied does not change as much as it is supposed to or as we expect to, simply because this kind of property is hard to find, is hard to come about. So the supply is limited. So as much as real estate developers will want to get a hold of a piece of beachfront land, they may not be able to do that. Okay, so in response to a change in the price, suppliers or real estate developers in this case are not able to respond as much. So on the other hand, we have some, manufactured goods such as books or cars. The supply is fairly elastic in response to a change in the price. Time period. The longer the time the sellers have to respond to a change in price, the more elastic the supply is. So, for example, in early 2000s, starting from early 2000 all the way to 2008, we had a period of time that we call a Super Bowl, commodity Super Bowl. So this is when the commodity prices went through the roof. Some of you may still remember prices of all agriculture products went through the roof. All metals, iron ore, steel, and also all the raw materials, coal and cotton, all went through the roof. Coffee beans went through the roofs. So coal, for example, the price of coal reached record high during that period of time. So the United States is known as the Saudi Arabia of coal. But when you look back at that period of time, almost 10 years, coal miners were very slow to change the production, to ramp up the production in response to a change in the price. Okay? So it's not that they don't want to take advantage of the record price of coal, but because there are a lot of limitations in terms of developing a new mine, because the United States is very tough on coal mining because it's very polluting. So Environmental Protection Act is very much against that. So it's very hard to get a permit to develop a new mine. And it's also very hard to reactivate an idle mine. It takes billions of dollars and years to develop a new mine and also reactivate an idle mine. And coal miners are also hard to find because it takes a lot of training to have coal miners because it is a very dangerous job. So it takes time for coal miners to get all these in place. And by the time that these are in place, it is about like 5 or 6 years past. So the longer the time that the coal miners had, the more they were able to respond to the change in price. So the next few slides is on incidence of tax. So this is how you apply price elasticity of supply and price elasticity of demand on who bears the burden of a sales tax. Okay? So I'm gonna skip these slides for the moment. So if you are interested, you can take a look at them, and then if you want to, we can discuss whatever that you don't understand. And then there's this case study on farmers. Once again, it is also on the elasticity, the applications of price elasticity of supply and demand. So we're going to skip these slides for the moment. But for those of you who are interested, please spend some time on them, and then you feel free to let me know if you want to discuss them. Okay, so let's move on to the next measure of elasticity. So we're going to turn to income elasticity of demand. So this is very similar to price elasticity of demand, but instead of measuring the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price, we're now looking at how quantity demanded of a good changes in response to a change in income. Okay, so it is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in income. Okay, so it's almost identical to price elasticity of demand, as you notice. In the only difference is the denominator now is the percentage change in income. So let's look at an example. So let's pause the video. Let's pause the video for about 5 to 10 minutes. Let's work on this calculation. So we want to calculate the income elasticity of demand using the point method and also the arc method. So it is important for you to practice the calculation on your own. So let's pause the video for 5 to 10 minutes. So this is our workout. Okay, so if you prefer, you can list all the relevant information here. So this is the initial income, and then the new income, and then the initial quantity demanded and the new quantity demanded. So let's first start with the point income elasticity of demand. So in order to find the percentage change in quantity demanded using the point method, so we have the new quantity minus the old quantity divided by the old quantity. And then we can find the percentage change in income. Okay, new income minus the old income divided by the old income. And if you want it in percentage, multiply it by 100%. So what we can see here is 20% increase in income leads to 100% increase in the quantity demanded. Okay? And then that leaves us with an income elasticity of demand of 5, point method. So let's turn on to midpoint income elasticity of demand. So instead of using the initial quantity, we now have the midpoint quantity. Okay, so the percentage change in quantity demanded using midpoint method is 66.67%, and then the percentage change in income 18.18%. Okay, and using the midpoint method, 18.18% increase in income leads to 66.67% increase in quantity demanded. So that leaves us with 3.67. Okay. So when it comes, let's recall what we learned in the beginning of the semester. When it comes to how income affects the demand for a good, we divide goods into two categories, normal goods and inferior good. So normal good is when income increases, the demand for normal goods increases. Okay? So when income drops, the demand for normal goods drops. So as a result, the income elasticity of demand should have a positive sign because the income and the demand for normal goods are positively related. Inferior good, as you recall, is those goods whose demands are negatively related to income. So as income rises, the demand for inferior good goes down, and then vice versa. So the income elasticity of demand for inferior goods are negative. Okay. So let's briefly touch on some of the factors that affect the size of income elasticity of demand. Basically, it has to do with the nature of the product. So if it's a necessity, then the income elasticity of demand tends to be low. For example, food, fuel, clothing, utilities, and medical services. So when times are tough, so for example, when we lose our jobs, the last few things that we will cut off are food, fuel, clothing, right? So those are the necessity. Okay? So the first few things that we will cut off if we lose our jobs tend to be luxuries, such as fancy cars, sports cars, furs, and expensive food. Okay, so we don't go to fancy restaurant as much anymore if our income goes down, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we tend to react the fastest when the fastest with luxury goods when our income changes. So the last measure of price elasticity of demand, price elasticity is cross price elasticity of demand. So very similar to price elasticity of demand, but instead of talking about one good, we're now looking at two goods. So it's a percentage change in quantity demanded of one good in response to a percentage change in the price of the other good. Okay? So this is especially important for businesses. Take, for example, McDonald's. McDonald's doesn't just sell one single product. It sells a very, very long product lines. Okay? So it sells burgers, it sells salad, it sells beverages, it sells what else? Desserts, coffee, and so on and so forth. So when McDonald's decides to have a promotion on Big Mac, for example, then it will have to consider the effect, the price effect on other products in the product line. So take for example, when it lowers the price of Big Mac, have a big sale, big promotion on Big Mac, okay? No doubt more people are going to buy Big Macs. But McDonald's has to know that, well, how many of those additional sales comes from, losing the sales in other kind of products, such as, fish fillets, okay, such as, chicken sandwiches, okay, such as, what else? Cheeseburgers, okay, and quarter pounders, and so on and so forth. So if people simply not buy, if people simply don't buy other kind of hamburgers and turn to Big Mac, that is not gonna do McDonald's any good. So that is something that McDonald's has to consider. Okay. So this can be obtained by finding the cross price elasticity of demand. So let's look at an example. Okay. So once again, let's pause the video for 5 to 10 minutes and let's practice the calculation. And we're not told which method to use, so unless we're otherwise told, we will use the midpoint method to find the cross price elasticity of demand in this case. So let's pause for 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, so the percentage change in quantity demanded using the midpoint method. Okay, so the difference between the two quantities divided by the average or the midpoint of the two quantities, that gives us 66.67%. And the percentage change in I'm sorry, it should be the price. Let me just change it a little bit. Okay, so the percentage change in the price of good 2 using the midpoint method, okay, so that will give us 100%. When you find the cross price elasticity of demand, that's the percentage change in quantity demanded of good 1 divided by the percentage change in the price of good 2. So that will give us 0.67. It's not a very strong relationship. Basically, what that tells us is 1% change in the price of good 2 leads to 0.67% change in the quantity demanded. So it's a positive sign. So basically that means they are substitutes. Okay? Because when the price of good 2 goes up, people, according to the law of demand, people don't want to buy as much good 2. And we see the demand for good 1 increases. So what that means is people turn from good 2 to good 1. So that tells us that they are substitutes. So when two goods are substitutes, the cross price elasticity of demand should be positive, and when they are complements, the cross price elasticity of demand should be negative. Okay? Right.